The monitor flatlined, and the world froze. But the doctor's hand stayed still. "No treatment," she whispered, until a janitor with tears in his eyes leaned forward and spoke 4 words that shattered the silence. "Before we dive in, drop a comment below and let me know where in the world you're watching from. And don't forget to hit subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you will not forget. It will blow your mind." The children's ward had its own kind of silence, not the comforting hush of a library or the reverent stillness of a church, but the kind that pressed against the ribs and made every breath feel borrowed. The air reeked of antiseptic, sharp and sterile, mixed with the faint sweetness of latex gloves. Machines hummed their mechanical lullabies in the ICU nearby, each beep and pulse a reminder that life here was measured in fragile seconds. Daniel Harlow moved slowly down the corridor, pushing his mop along the glossy linoleum. At 42, his back ached more than it used to, and his eyes carried shadows that had nothing to do with age. To anyone passing by, he was just another janitor keeping the floors clean. Invisible, replaceable. But tonight, invisibility was a kind of prison, because behind one of those closed doors, his daughter lay fighting for her life. He stole a glance as he passed the narrow window, careful not to linger too long in case a nurse barked at him for being in the way. What he saw made his chest tighten until he could barely move the mop. Emily, his little girl, 12 years old but still small enough to curl into his lap when nightmares came, was covered in wires and plastic. Tubes snaked from her arms, monitors blinked in harsh neon, and her chest rose in shallow, uneven waves. It was wrong, so deeply wrong, to see a child so fragile, her body dwarfed by the machinery meant to keep her alive. He wanted to fling the door open, to sweep everything aside, and gather her in his arms the way he did when she fell off her bike, or when fever flushed her cheeks and she whimpered for comfort. But janitors didn't storm ICU rooms. Janitors stayed on their side of the glass. They cleaned the mess left after everyone else had already given up. The mop handle creaked beneath his grip as he forced himself to keep moving, his strokes mechanical, almost ceremonial, like if he could just polish the floor enough. Maybe the world inside those rooms would come clean too. He remembered when Emily was born, when he first held her, swaddled and pink and impossibly light. His wife had been alive then, laughing through tears, teasing him for crying harder than the baby. That was another lifetime. The accident had taken her too soon, and for years now Daniel had worn grief like a second skin. Emily was all he had left, the tether that kept him from dissolving entirely into loneliness. His heart whispered the words he couldn't bear to say aloud, words that tasted like betrayal on his tongue. "You're losing her." Every step of the mop felt like digging his own grave, each pass across the tile another reminder that he was powerless in the one place that mattered. He had fought so hard to keep her world bright despite the bills stacking high, the nights of skipped meals so she wouldn't go hungry. The shifts doubled until his hands blistered. He had survived for her, and now he watched as machines decided whether she would survive for him. A nurse brushed past him, muttering something about oxygen levels, and Daniel instinctively stepped back, clutching the mop like a weapon he had no idea how to use. He looked down at his shoes, scuffed and dull, then back at the glint of the ICU window. The contrast was cruel, his world full of dirt and labor, hers now full of light and wires. For a moment he closed his eyes, pretending he could hear her laugh again, the way it used to echo through their apartment when she found something funny in one of his bad jokes. That laugh had been his lifeline. Tonight, silence had taken its place. He pushed the mop into the bucket, wrung it out, and continued down the hallway, but his gaze kept drifting back to that door, that tiny pane of glass that separated him from the one thing he couldn't afford to lose. If anyone had asked him right then what he believed in, he wouldn't have said God or medicine or miracles. He would have said Emily, just her name, just his girl. And as the machines hummed and the antiseptic stung his throat, he knew with a cold certainty that if he couldn't find a way to hold on to her, Nothing else in his life would matter. Dr. Elena Marquez moved through the room with the economy of motion that comes from decades of practice, precise steps, measured breath, hands that did not shake because they could not afford to. At 38, she had become a quiet kind of legend on the pediatric floor. Brilliant, exacting, the sort of doctor whose name reassured donors and terrified diseases. Families learned to trust her, the way sailors learn to trust a lighthouse. You might not like the light, but you followed it because it kept you from crashing. Tonight, under the humming of fluorescent fixtures and the thin blue glow of monitors, she looked every inch the person they had relied on for years. Her gloves were off, her fingers laced together as if she could steady the world by folding it into neat lines. No resuscitation, she said, not to the room at large, but, low and final, to the nurse who stood by the bedside with a clipboard pressed to her chest. The words were clinical, calibrated, a verdict that had been weighed in some private ledger of risks and benefits. They landed like knives. The nurse's pen paused mid-stroke. The fluorescent hum seemed to sharpen. Outside, the corridor continued its indifferent tide of footsteps, but inside that little room, time changed its shape. Daniel heard it through the half-open door before he saw the motion of her leaving. The sentence snagged him like a hook. He had been wandering the halls with a mop and a heart tight as a fist. People assumed janitors worked on the periphery, unseen and unnecessary. Tonight, the periphery had turned into a vantage point he never wanted but could not abandon. No resuscitation, he heard again, as if through cotton. His knees went soft. He gripped the mop handle so hard his knuckles blanched. "She's just a child," he managed, voice small and raw. The words pushed out of him like something that had been lodged too long in his throat. Elena did not flinch. Her face did not give him the mercy of sympathy. Instead, she turned with the practiced efficiency of someone used to carrying hard truths. "Her heart can't handle another shock," she said, voice even. "Continuing will only make her suffer." The nurse clasped the clipboard with both hands, the tremor obvious now, as if the paper itself could contain the tremor of her heart. A ventilator sighed, a pump purred, the fluorescent lights rinsed the room in their clean, indifferent color. For a second, the sheen of the monitor seemed almost obscene, tracking numbers, while a family's world narrowed to a single catastrophic decision. Daniel felt fury like heat behind his ribs. It was a pure, animal anger that had nothing to do with protocol and everything to do with a father's bones. "You can't decide that," he said more to himself than to her. "You can't—" He stopped because the words sounded hysterical, and hysteria did not sway a machine or a chart or a woman who had learned to let the facts do the speaking. Elena's jaw tightened. She had been taught, maybe forced, to let compassion coexist with calculus, to weigh pain against prospects, to be a steward of probability. She had seen children linger for a mercy that only prolonged indignity. She had seen families beg for miracles that weren't there to be had. She didn't say it out loud, but the ledger in her head had columns that filled with years of experience, past treatments, marginal benefits, the physiological toll Emily had already borne. Each entry had the potential to justify the other, to make her feel right for the decision she had made. But that ledger could not measure what lived in a father's hands when he cupped a child's cheek. "Protocols exist for a reason," she told the nurse, softly but without apology, as if repeating the line would make it truer, the way some people repeat prayers. Yet even as she formed the words, the nurse nodded with an uneven breath. Elena could feel something in the room shift. It was not equipment, not training. It was the sound of a human heart refusing to be reduced to risk percentages. There were faces at the threshold, a resident with exhaustion stitched into his collar, a technician whose eyes flitted like a bird's, strangers who'd come because the ward made them feel magnified in the face of suffering. The room smelled of disinfectant and the faint sweetness of hand cream. The air tasted like metal. Daniel's chest burned with the knowledge that he had no degree, no credential, no legal standing in this sterile cathedral of medicine. What he did have was a small girl who had once fit snugly in his lap, who had called him Daddy in a voice that stitched daylight into their nights. He had nothing else he would stake on this. Elena straightened, preparing to walk away, a decisive, professional motion that would close the argument before it had teeth. She did not know then that she was about to be stopped, not by policy, not by law, but by something raw and human that would refuse to be categorized or sterilized, a father's refusal to lose his child without naming the pain first. Daniel stepped into the room like a man trespassing in a cathedral, mop handle clutched in his fist as though it could shield him from what was coming. The polished floor squeaked under his boots, and the sharp scent of antiseptic clung to him, the uniform of someone meant to stay invisible. He knew he shouldn't have crossed the threshold. Janitors didn't enter rooms unless summoned. They swept around grief, mopped up after hope had fled, kept their heads bowed and their mouths closed. But tonight his daughter lay on that bed, pale and still, and something inside him had cracked wide open. Dr. Elena Marquez turned, startled by his presence, then immediately stiffened, annoyance flashing across her composed features. "Sir, you can't be here," she said sharply, her tone the kind she used to end arguments before they began. It was authority wrapped in certainty, the sound of someone who had been obeyed for years without question. But Daniel didn't move. His throat tightened, words clawing their way out past exhaustion and fear. When they came, they were nothing eloquent, nothing rehearsed, just 4 plain syllables dragged raw from the marrow of him. "She's all I have." The room changed. The machines still beeped their steady rhythms, the monitors still blinked, the air still smelled of alcohol swabs and latex, but everything human in that space froze. The nurse nearest to Emily paused mid-note, her pen hovering over the clipboard. Another nurse, adjusting an IV line, glanced quickly at Elena, then back at Daniel, as though unsure which command mattered more, protocol or pain. Elena's jaw tightened, her body language still disciplined, but her eyes betrayed the flicker of something she hadn't expected to feel. Hesitation. For years she had lived in the realm of numbers and charts, probabilities and thresholds, her emotions filed away in a drawer she never opened. But those words cut through the sterile order she had built like a scalpel, slicing deeper than intended. She had told countless parents no before. She had explained futility, laid out the brutal math of survival rates. Some screamed. Some begged. Some fell silent. But this man hadn't begged for miracles, hadn't demanded she perform the impossible. He had simply offered 4 words that stripped him bare. Not a plea, not a threat. Just a truth so fragile it ached in the air. "She's all I have." The silence stretched. It wasn't medical anymore. It wasn't about what Emily's body could or could not endure. It was moral, human, messy, and it sat heavy in the sterile room. Daniel's hands trembled as he lowered the mop handle to his side. He didn't even realize he was still holding it, like some poor man's sword. His eyes weren't on the machines, or the chart, or even the doctor. They were on his daughter, tiny against the mountain of tubes and wires. The way her chest rose just barely, as if she were whispering to him that she hadn't left yet. Elena inhaled, shallow but audible, and for the first time in years she didn't know what to do next. Her certainty faltered. She wasn't facing vitals on a monitor anymore. She was facing a father who had already lost more than anyone should, standing in front of the last piece of his world. She could almost hear the echo of her own brother's laughter in the space between his words. The memory she'd worked so hard to bury, tugging at her bones. The nurses waited, their eyes darting nervously. No one wanted to be the first to break the silence. It was as if the room itself was holding its breath, waiting to see if love could bend protocol. Elena's gaze dropped for just a second, and that was enough. The armor she wore, the unshakable composure everyone trusted, had cracked. Just a fracture, but it was there. Daniel swallowed hard, his voice ragged but steady as he whispered again, softer this time, almost to himself, "She's all I have." And in those words, Elena realized, was not just desperation, it was a dare. A dare to look past the charts, a dare to see the person, not the patient, a dare to remember that sometimes medicine wasn't just about saving bodies, sometimes it was about saving the people who would live with the silence after. For the first time, Elena felt herself caught not between life and death, but between right and right, and she hated how much she suddenly understood him. The room had become a chamber of silence, broken only by the high whine of the defibrillator charging. Elena pressed her lips together, a line carved from years of discipline, and lowered the paddles onto Emily's small chest. Her voice was steady, clinical, stripped of everything but command. "Clear!" The current surged, jolting the child's body upward. The monitor blinked, flatline. A single merciless tone filled the air. Daniel's knees weakened. He gripped the edge of the bed so hard his knuckles went white, as if he could anchor his daughter to this world by sheer force of will. His breath came in shallow bursts, torn between hope and collapse. Elena didn't stop. She reset, hands moving with machine-like precision. Another attempt. "Clear!" The paddles hissed. Emily's body jumped again, then fell still. The monitor stretched another flat horizon across its screen, the sound of nothing. Daniel bent, forehead pressed to his arm, the mop handle abandoned at his side. It wasn't supposed to end like this, not with machines and strangers, not with silence where laughter used to live. He had promised her after her mother's funeral that he would never leave her, never let her feel the hollow he'd felt. And now, helpless, he felt that promise crumbling inside him. Elena stared at the monitor, willing it to break, to flicker, to give her something. Her entire career had taught her to prepare for this moment, to deliver condolences with composure, to step back when the line refused to return. She told herself she had seen this before, dozens of times, maybe hundreds. But this child was not like the others. This child's father had just looked at her with eyes so raw, so stripped of pride, and said 4 words that still echoed in her chest, "She's all I have." The nurse's hand trembled on the clipboard. Another nurse shifted from foot to foot, torn between duty and despair. And then it happened. Faint. So faint it could have been imagination. A blip. A rise and fall on the monitor, quick and fragile. Like the timid knock of someone asking if they could come back in. The sound cut through the flat line with the smallest chirp. The room stilled. Elena's eyes snapped to the screen. The flat horizon broke again. A second blip, weak but undeniable. The line stuttered, then trembled into rhythm. Not steady, not strong, but real. "Impossible," Elena whispered, the words slipping from her lips before she could stop it. She blinked, once, twice, almost afraid to believe. She had seen hearts restart before, but never like this. Never after so much time. Never this fragile. Never under circumstances that should have made it futile. Her certainty cracked. The ground beneath her clinical precision shifted like sand underfoot. Daniel gasped, his whole body folding toward the bed. He leaned close, his voice breaking as he pressed his lips near his daughter's ear. "I'm here, Em. I'm not leaving. Do you hear me?" "I'm right here." His tears fell, one by one, sliding onto her small hand, tracing rivers down pale skin. He clutched her fingers, cold but not gone, and pressed them to his cheek. "You fight, sweetheart. You come back to me." The monitor responded with another blip, then another, faint but gathering. The rhythm steadied, as though she could hear him from somewhere deep inside, as though love itself was coaxing her heart to remember its duty. Nurses glanced at one another, their shock visible, their disbelief giving way to awe. Elena swallowed hard, fighting the lump in her throat. For years she had told herself she was immune, a professional bound by reason, but now she was staring at the unexplainable, not medicine, not chance, something else entirely. She couldn't name it, but she could feel it, the undeniable truth that this child hadn't responded to voltage alone. She had responded to a voice, to her father's tears, to love. Daniel kept whispering, rocking slightly, forehead against her hand. "I've got you, Em. Daddy's not going anywhere." And as the weak pulse gathered strength, filling the room with a fragile but undeniable hope, Elena felt a tremor inside her chest. For the first time in years, her certainty wasn't certainty at all. It was wonder, and it terrified her. The hallway outside the ICU was too quiet, as if even the walls were listening to the aftermath of what had just happened. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, sterile and unwavering. But Daniel's chest still thundered with the memory of the monitor's blip, that fragile, defiant sound of life returning. He leaned against the wall, mop abandoned at his side, eyes red-rimmed but steady. His daughter was breathing, weak and shallow, but breathing. That was enough for him. It had to be. Elena emerged moments later, her lab coat snapping faintly as she moved, her composure pieced back together like armor hastily repaired after a battle. She spotted him instantly, as though he had no right to linger, no right to breathe the same air in the space where life and death wrestled nightly. Her heels struck against the tile with sharp finality until she stopped in front of him. Her voice came out clipped, sharp, the tone of someone determined to end an argument before it began. "You don't understand," she snapped, words slicing through the stillness. "What happened was luck. A coincidence. She's too fragile to survive another collapse. Don't build hope where there isn't any." Daniel pushed himself off the wall, his tired eyes locking on hers. He didn't raise his voice, didn't snarl or spit back. His tone was calm, but the calm of someone anchored so deeply in truth that no storm could shake him. "It wasn't luck," he said. "It was her hearing someone believe she still mattered." The words struck harder than shouting ever could. Elena's jaw tightened. She folded her arms across her chest, fists curling beneath the fabric of her sleeves. This was not a conversation she was supposed to be having. She was trained to lead families through grief with certainty, to close the door on false hope before it consumed them. For decades she had held that line, clinical, detached, precise. It was the only way she had survived the years of children slipping away beneath her hands. She had built her life around control, around the power of separating emotion from fact. And now this janitor, this man with tired eyes, with stained coveralls and calloused hands, was standing in front of her, daring to suggest she'd been wrong. She opened her mouth to retort, but nothing came. Instead, the silence stretched, filled only by the echo of Emily's heartbeat replaying in her mind. That weak but undeniable rhythm had imprinted itself on her more than she wanted to admit. She had shocked hearts before, resuscitated bodies before, but never had she seen one respond like that, not to voltage, but to a voice. Daniel's gaze softened, but his words stayed firm. "She heard me," he said quietly. "That's what pulled her back. You think it was machines, but it wasn't. It was someone reminding her she wasn't gone yet." Elena turned her head, blinking fast, trying to regain the control that had slipped. This wasn't supposed to happen. Doctors didn't falter. Doctors didn't question themselves because of sentiment. But she couldn't ignore it. In the hollow of her chest, something stirred, something she hadn't felt in years. An ache, an unwelcome tenderness, a reminder of a boy she once sat beside in a hospital bed, her younger brother begging her to play piano for him while he faded. She hadn't done it. She had kept her distance, and she had regretted it every day since. Her throat tightened, though her voice came out cold. "You don't get it," she said. "You don't see the statistics, the prognosis, the reality." Daniel didn't flinch. "No," he said softly. "I see my daughter. I see a little girl who still wants to live, and I see a doctor who's afraid to admit that sometimes the numbers don't know everything." The words landed like a quiet blow. She hated how much truth was in them. For the first time in years, Elena felt her certainty slipping, and standing in front of her was a man who had no credentials, no degrees, no authority, only love so raw it dared her to question everything she thought she knew. The hallway seemed smaller, air thicker, as they stared at each other, neither willing to step back, neither willing to surrender. Two worlds clashing, science and love, protocol and faith. But in the space between them, in the fragile echo of Emily's pulse, the line wasn't as clear as Elena wanted it to be. Daniel sat slumped in the plastic chair, the kind that made even a short wait feel like punishment. The waiting area was empty now, except for the humming soda machine in the corner and the soft shuffle of a nurse's shoes down the hall. His hands rested on his knees, broad and rough, the skin cracked and stained from years of scrubbing floors. He stared at them as though they belonged to someone else, turning them slowly, palms up, palms down. Once those same hands had made music, strong enough to strum chords on a battered guitar while his wife sang along, her voice sweet and low, carrying into summer nights on their porch. Once those hands had held a newborn daughter with trembling awe, terrified he might break something so small, so perfect. He remembered the way Rachel, his wife, had laughed at him the first night home from the hospital, watching him hover over the crib like a soldier on watch. "She's not glass, Danny," she had teased, brushing his arm. "She's ours. She's stronger than she looks." That memory flickered through him now, cruel in its gentleness, because Rachel's strength hadn't saved her when the accident came. One phone call, one icy road, one split second that ripped her out of his life and left him with a daughter too young to understand why her mother never came home. The hands he stared at now had carried both their lives since then. They had traded strings and melodies for buckets and mops, for minimum wages and aching joints. The calluses he once wore proudly from long hours of practice were gone, replaced by blisters from bleach and hot water. He told himself it was noble, that survival was its own kind of song. But noble didn't make the nights shorter. When Emily coughed with fever and he pressed a cool cloth to her forehead until dawn. Noble didn't make the mornings easier when he slid his plate toward her and told her he wasn't hungry, watching her eat the last egg while his stomach clenched tight. To the world, Daniel Harlow was a ghost in coveralls, the man who emptied trash cans in the conference room before executives arrived, who polished the marble floors so donors' shoes would click against shine. People saw the mop, the cart, the bowed head, and not the man behind it. They didn't see the guitar hidden in the back of his closet, unplayed for years. They didn't see the notebooks filled with half-sketched songs he never had time to finish. They didn't see the way he lingered at Emily's bedside every night, whispering promises he wasn't sure he could keep. But Emily saw him. She always had. To her, he wasn't invisible. He was everything. The man who braided her hair badly but tried anyway, who taped together the wings of her paper airplanes, who sat through her school recitals clapping louder than anyone else. He was father and mother, protector and friend. He was the world she trusted, the anchor she clung to in a life that had taken too much already. Tonight, when those 4 words had left his mouth, "She's all I have," they hadn't been planned. He hadn't meant to plead, he had meant to survive. The words tore out of him, not like a strategy, not like a speech, but like a man stripped to bone. They were truth, the kind that can't be rehearsed, only lived. He realized as he sat there staring at his hands that he had nothing left to give the world except those words, that love. And maybe that was enough. The soda machine hummed louder, rattling slightly, as though reminding him that life went on in mechanical ways even when hearts stopped and restarted. He flexed his fingers, rubbed his palms together, and closed his eyes. For a moment he imagined Rachel's voice again, teasing him, soothing him. For a moment he imagined Emily as she had been, pigtails, scraped knees, laughter bright as summer. He opened his eyes to the harsh hospital light, his chest heavy but steady. The world could call him a janitor. They could pass by without noticing. But Emily knew. She knew who he was. And for her, he would always be enough. Elena closed the office door behind her with more force than she intended, the click echoing through the sterile quiet like a gavel. She pressed her back against it for a moment, eyes closed, forcing her breathing into measured counts, the way she had trained herself to do during surgeries, during crises, during every moment when she wasn't allowed to be human. But her hands betrayed her, trembling as though they belonged to someone else. She crossed to her desk, pulled open the drawer, and retrieved the bottle she pretended was for guests. She poured the whiskey into her coffee mug, no pretense of mixing, no effort to disguise the act. The amber liquid shook in the cup as she lifted it, her fingers refusing the steady precision they usually obeyed. The first swallow burned, sharp and punishing, but it was the kind of pain she understood, a pain she could control. She let the fire chase away the cold hollow inside her, at least for a moment. But the silence of the office pressed in around her, and with it came the memory she never let surface until it broke through like a body rising from water. Her brother, Marco. 12 years old, frail from leukemia, his skin translucent as candle wax. She had been 16, already a prodigy, already praised for her brilliance. He had begged her in a voice barely above a whisper, "Play for me, Elena, just once, play the piano." The instrument stood in the corner of the hospital room, untouched, polished, waiting. She had refused, not because she didn't want to, but because she couldn't. The thought of him dying with her music in his ears felt unbearable, like she would be complicit in the moment his chest stilled. She had folded her arms, shaken her head, looked away. He had smiled at her anyway, a soft, forgiving smile that haunted her long after the monitors went silent. He died without the song. Since then, she had buried herself in numbers and charts, in the logic of protocols, in the armor of control. She became the doctor who never faltered, never hesitated, because hesitation was weakness, and weakness killed. She learned to keep families at a distance, to wrap her humanity so tightly that grief couldn't find a seam to slip through. Data didn't cry, protocol didn't beg, control didn't break. But tonight, Daniel's voice had cracked her open with 4 words so simple they should have meant nothing. "She's all I have." They had dragged her back into that room with Marco, into the memory of a boy who wanted nothing more than a lullaby and a sister too afraid to give it. She had told herself she'd built a life to save children, but maybe she'd been building a fortress to save herself from remembering the one she couldn't. She stared at her reflection in the dark glass of the office window, her lab coat, her neat hair, her careful posture, armor. Yet behind her eyes was something else, something raw she had buried so deeply it startled her to see it alive again. She raised the mug, whispering to herself as though she could hide the words under the sound of the swallow. "She's all I have." This time the whiskey burned like confession, like punishment, like prayer. Her hand shook as she set the mug down, liquid sloshing over the rim, staining the stack of case files beneath. She didn't wipe it away. For once, she let the mess sit, amber spreading across black ink. She pressed her palms to her face, hot tears pricking her eyes. She hated herself for it, hated the weakness, but she couldn't stop. Because behind Daniel's rawness, behind Emily's fragile pulse, she had seen herself. The girl who had once loved music, who had once had a brother who believed in her. And the woman who had learned to pretend she didn't remember what it felt like to fail someone you loved. The whiskey did nothing to soften the truth. For the first time in years, Elena felt the weight of her own shadow pressing down on her, heavy and unrelenting, whispering that maybe she wasn't the lighthouse after all, maybe she was just another person stumbling in the dark, praying not to lose her way. The alarms shattered the fragile quiet of the ward, their piercing shriek slicing through walls, pulling everyone into motion. Hours had passed since the first crisis, hours where Daniel had sat stiffly in his chair outside the room, every sound of a monitor pulling at his nerves like wires strung too tight. But when the alarm screamed again, he was already on his feet, already moving before his mind caught up. He burst through the door just as Emily's small body convulsed against the bed, the wires straining, her arms jerking as though her tiny frame was being pulled in two directions. Elena was there in seconds, snapping on gloves, her voice cutting through the chaos with practiced commands. "Get the crash cart!" "Prepare episode. Increase oxygen flow, now." Nurses moved like dancers trained for emergencies, each step familiar, each motion sharp and precise. But in the middle of the ordered storm, Daniel was already at his daughter's side, his calloused hand clutching hers with a desperation that no manual could teach. "Fight, baby," he choked, his voice cracking, breaking into pieces that fell across the sterile floor. "Fight. Don't you leave me." Emily's chest heaved, her breaths erratic, her skin paling into something fragile and wrong. The monitor spat out its jagged story, lines dipping, rising, faltering. Elena's hands moved, but tonight they were not the detached instruments of science. They were trembling. She tried to steady them, tried to remind herself she had done this hundreds of times, but she could feel her heart hammering against her ribs. Too loud, too fast. For the first time in her career, fear didn't just live in the room, it lived inside her. Daniel bent closer, his forehead brushing Emily's arm, his tears falling onto her skin. "You hear me, Em? Daddy's right here. I'm not going anywhere. You fight, sweetheart. You hear me? Fight." His words weren't commands, weren't even pleas. They were lifelines, fragile ropes thrown into the abyss in hopes she might grab hold. The line on the monitor wavered dangerously, dipped low, stretching toward the flat horizon that had haunted the room earlier that night. Daniel felt his lungs collapse, his knees buckle, as if the world was preparing to hollow itself out beneath him. But then, a blip, faint, fragile, barely there. Another, weak but real. The line spiked, jagged and unsteady, like a child learning to walk again. The room went still. The alarms quieted, replaced by the uneven rhythm of a pulse clawing its way back from the brink. Relief hit Daniel so hard his legs gave out. He collapsed into the chair, his body folding under the weight of survival, sobs ripping out of him with no rhythm or restraint. He clutched Emily's hand to his chest, rocking forward as though holding her closer might tether her spirit in place. "Thank you," he gasped, not even sure who he was speaking to. The machines, his daughter, God himself, maybe all of them. Elena turned her face away, barking a final order to adjust the drip, but her voice cracked at the edges. Heat burned at the corners of her eyes. Tears she had sworn off years ago, pushing against walls she had thought unbreakable. She bit the inside of her cheek, but it was useless. The sting of salt welled anyway. Because she knew, with a certainty that rattled her to her core, that science had not brought this girl back alone. Medicine had played its part, but something else had entered the equation. Something beyond her training, beyond the protocols she had clung to for survival. She looked at Daniel, hunched and broken, but still holding, still speaking life into his daughter's ear. And she realized, terrified, that maybe what she had dismissed as sentiment, as false hope, was something truer than any chart she'd ever studied. Love had dragged Emily back when nothing else could. And that truth unsettled her more than any flatline ever had. The hallway outside the ward felt like a different world after the chaos inside. No alarms, no clipped commands, no metallic clatter of carts against the floor. Just silence. The kind that sat heavy in the chest, made every breath feel measured and deliberate. Daniel dropped into one of the rigid chairs lined up against the wall, his whole body folding forward, elbows on his knees. He stared at the floor tiles as though they could hold him together. His shirt was damp with sweat, his hands trembling from everything they'd just lived through, but he refused to let them hang idle. They stayed curled, as if still holding on to Emily, even though she was behind the glass. Elena sat down 3 chairs away at first, the practiced distance of a woman who had built a career on boundaries. She pressed her palms flat against her thighs, the starched fabric of her coat rustling faintly. Her breathing was shallow, her lips pressed into a line. She could still hear the echo of the alarms, still feel the tremor in her own hands, still see the flash of Daniel's head bent over his daughter's arm, whispering her back into the world. For a long while neither spoke. It wasn't the kind of silence filled with hostility, though, but the kind that lingered when words weren't enough to catch up to what had just happened. Two people who had fought from opposite ends of the battlefield, now stranded on the same side with nothing left but exhaustion. Finally, Elena broke the stillness, her voice low, her tone stripped of authority. "You were right." She kept her eyes forward, fixed on the seam where the wall met the floor. I was ready to let go before she did. Daniel turned his head, studying her for a moment. He looked worn, hollowed out, but his eyes still carried that stubborn steadiness, that quiet refusal to yield. His voice was rough when he answered, but steady. "Then don't." "Not yet." The words landed between them, simple and impossible, all at once. Elena's throat tightened. She had lived her entire adult life by charts, data, statistics. She had built her reputation on being unshakable, the one who didn't fold when parents broke, who didn't let emotions dictate decisions. And yet here was a janitor, his coverall still stained from a shift he never finished, telling her the one thing she didn't realize she needed to hear. Not yet. She risked a glance at him then. His shoulders slumped, his eyes rimmed red, his whole body showing the wear of years spent fighting battles no one applauded. And still, he sat there with a kind of defiance she couldn't explain. He wasn't reckless, wasn't naive. He knew the odds as well as she did, but he refused to surrender. They sat in silence again, but this time it felt different. Not the silence of strangers, but of two people who had shared the same unbearable moment, who carried the same fragile burden of hope. Neither trusted the other fully. Elena still clung to her need for control, and Daniel still bristled at her clinical detachment, but for the first time the lines between them blurred. A nurse passed by quietly, offering a sympathetic nod, but neither of them moved. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and down the hall a machine beeped faintly, reminding them that life continued in fragments all around them. Still, for this moment, there was no chaos, no division, just a fragile truce forged in the thin space between survival and surrender. Daniel leaned back, closing his eyes, his chest rising and falling in slow, deliberate breaths. Elena folded her hands together in her lap, her knuckles pale, her thoughts drifting to a boy she once couldn't save and to a girl who now refused to stop fighting. She felt the weight of both pressing against her ribs, demanding she carry them together. Hope was too fragile to name, too delicate to admit aloud. But it was there, undeniable, sitting between a janitor and a doctor in the silence of a hospital hallway. For the first time, neither of them tried to push it away. The apartment smelled faintly of dust and forgotten years when Daniel pulled the old guitar from the back of the storage closet. The case creaked as he opened it, hinges reluctant from disuse, and inside lay the instrument that had once been the center of his world. The strings were rusted, their metal dulled with time, and a thin veil of dust clung stubbornly to the wood. He ran his hand across it, fingertips tracing grooves he had made long ago, worn spots from nights when music had been his only language. For a moment he just stood there, the weight of it in his hands almost unbearable. He sat at the edge of his bed, the silence in the apartment pressing down on him. He remembered when it hadn't been silent, when Rachel used to sit cross-legged on the floor, singing along as he strummed. Her voice wasn't perfect, but it was alive, full of a joy that filled the tiny apartment like sunlight through open blinds. She used to throw her head back when she laughed, unafraid of the neighbors who might hear, unafraid of anything. That laugh lived in the body of the guitar, tucked between the wood and the strings, waiting for him to summon it again. When Emily was born, he had written her a lullaby. He still remembered the night, the hospital room, the exhaustion, the fear, and the overwhelming love. He had picked up the guitar in their apartment weeks later, his daughter cradled in Rachel's arms, and he had played the lullaby until her tiny eyelids drooped. Rachel had whispered, "She'll always know her daddy's voice." He had believed it then, but when Rachel died, the music died with her. He couldn't touch the guitar without feeling as though he was betraying her memory. Every chord sounded like loss, every note scraped against the edges of grief he couldn't dull. He had closed the case and shoved it into the closet, where it sat like a coffin collecting dust, until tonight. He carried it with him to the hospital, the weight unfamiliar after so many years. He didn't ask permission. He just slipped into Emily's room when the hall quieted and the nurses turned their attention elsewhere. He pulled the chair closer to her bed, settled in, and let his fingers find their way across strings that resisted at first. The sound was rough, brittle, trembling like his own heart. But then slowly, he coaxed the melody from memory, the lullaby he had written just for her. The notes spilled into the air, soft and cracked but real, weaving through the beeping monitors and the steady hiss of machines. The hospital room changed. It no longer felt like a battlefield of wires and tubes, but like a space carved out for love to breathe again. Daniel's voice didn't rise to meet the music, only his tears did, sliding down his face as his fingers moved with remembered tenderness. Emily stirred. Her eyelids fluttered, lashes quivering against her pale cheeks. Her hand twitched faintly beneath his. He leaned closer, voice breaking as he whispered, "It's your song, baby girl. Daddy's here, always." Unseen from the hall, Elena stood frozen. She had meant only to check the monitors to assure herself that Emily was stable before retreating to the safety of her office. But she stopped when she heard the guitar. The sound was raw, imperfect, yet it slipped past the armor she wore so tightly. Each note tugged at something buried deep, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel since her brother's hospital bed, since the day silence became her refuge. She pressed a hand to her chest, her throat tight, her eyes burning. It wasn't medicine, it wasn't data, it wasn't science, but it was healing something that numbers never could. And as she stood there in the dim glow of the hallway, Elena realized that this man with calloused hands and a broken heart had given his daughter more life with a cracked lullaby than she had with all her charts and training. For the first time in years, she wanted to believe in something she couldn't measure. The morning sun filtered weakly through the tall windows of the hospital boardroom, its warmth no match for the chill in the air. The walls themselves seemed to carry judgment, lined with portraits of stern-faced donors and brass plaques announcing endowments. Daniel stood just outside the doorway, uncertain if he even had the right to be there. His mop and bucket had been left in the corridor, tools abandoned like armor discarded before battle. Inside he could hear the low hum of voices, clipped and sharp, punctuated by the scrape of leather shoes across the polished floor. When Elena entered, her lab coat crisp, her face composed, the conversation shifted. Dr. Carmichael, tall and lean, with silver hair combed back in surgical precision, fixed his gaze on her the way a hawk studies prey. He didn't bother with pleasantries. "What happened last night was unacceptable," he said, his tone slicing clean through the stale air. "Unprofessional indulgence, Elena. You let a janitor interfere with medical decisions." The word janitor cracked like a whip, meant to reduce Daniel to nothing more than the dirt he scrubbed. Elena opened her mouth, hesitation tightening her throat, but before she could form a defense, a voice rose steady and unyielding from the doorway. "I'm not interfering," Daniel said, stepping inside. His coveralls were still stained, his hands still raw, but his eyes carried a steadiness that silenced the murmurs instantly. He took a single step forward, his presence almost defiant against the weight of the room. "I'm staying." Carmichael's lip curled, amusement and disdain colliding in the expression of a man who had never been challenged from beneath him. "You'll be fired for this," he hissed, the promise of consequence heavy in his tone. "You don't belong here. You don't belong in these conversations, in these decisions. You are staff, disposable." Daniel didn't flinch. He straightened, shoulders squaring, jaw set with quiet fire. "I've already lost everything that mattered once," he said, his voice low but powerful, carrying into every corner of the room. "I won't again." The silence that followed was heavier than any threat. The nurses who had been summoned as witnesses shifted uneasily. The board members avoided eye contact, their hands fidgeting with pens and folders. Even Carmichael, so certain of his authority, faltered for half a beat before narrowing his gaze. Elena's breath caught in her chest. She had spent years terrified of protocol, of consequences, of the sharp reprimand of men like Carmichael. She had silenced herself more times than she could count, choosing safety over defiance, rules over risk. But now, watching Daniel, this man who scrubbed floors, who had nothing left but his daughter, stand tall against power he could never hope to match, something inside her shifted. His courage was raw, unpolished, but undeniable. And it sparked something in her she hadn't felt since she was a girl sitting at her brother's bedside, wishing she had played him a song instead of staying silent. For the first time in years, Elena wanted to defend someone else. Not as a doctor, not as a professional, but as a human being. She looked at Carmichael, her superior, the man who had once been the measure of everything she thought she should be, and, for the first time, she wasn't afraid. "Daniel isn't disposable," she said, her voice even but carrying an edge Carmichael hadn't heard from her before. The board members shifted again, surprise rippling across their faces. "He's the reason Emily is alive today." Carmichael scoffed, but it rang hollow. Daniel stood silent now, not needing to add more. His words had already laid claim to the truth, and everyone in that room had felt it. The silence thickened, not awkward but heavy with recognition. For once, it wasn't the authority of titles or protocols that carried weight. It was the quiet defiance of a janitor who had nothing to lose except the one life he refused to let go of. And in that moment, even Elena knew he had already won. The third collapse came like a storm without warning. One moment the room was steady, the quiet rhythm of machines marking time. The next, the monitors exploded into sound, shrill and merciless. The flat line stretched across the screen, relentless, unforgiving. Nurses rushed in, voices rising higher than before, panic tugging at the corners of their training. The air thickened with urgency, gloves snapping, carts wheeling, feet scrambling. Elena stood rooted at the foot of the bed, her breath lodged somewhere between her chest and her throat. Her eyes locked on Emily's small body convulsing beneath the weight of wires and tubes, and for the first time her hands did not move. She saw her brother there instead, Marco, 12 years old, pale and gasping, begging her to play for him, begging her to stay. She had turned away then, frozen, afraid, and now the ghost of that moment clawed at her, whispering that she was failing again. Her pulse thundered in her ears, drowning out the chaos. She could hear nurses calling numbers, doses, compressions. Someone shoved paddles into her hands, but her fingers curled uselessly around them, her knuckles white, her body locked in memory. Then came Daniel's voice, not loud, not commanding, just raw. He bent close to his daughter, his forehead nearly touching hers, his tears falling freely onto her pale skin. "She's all I have." 4 words, the same words that had pierced the room before, now whispered like a prayer too fragile to survive, yet too powerful to ignore. Something broke in Elena's chest, a crack so deep it felt like an earthquake splitting the foundation she had built her life on. She blinked, her vision blurring, and for the first time in years, she stopped being the doctor who couldn't falter. She became the sister who once did, and she refused to let it happen again. Her body jolted back into motion. "Clear!" she barked, her voice suddenly steady, almost fierce. Electricity surged. Emily's body arched, then fell limp again. The flat line wavered. No rhythm. Not yet. Elena's hands didn't tremble now. They moved with fury, with desperation. Not just skill, but grief sharpened into resolve. She pressed harder, shouted orders louder, every action infused with a refusal that bordered on defiance. Daniel's voice wove through hers, a counterpoint of love and pleading. "Come on, baby. You can do this. Daddy's here. Fight. Please, fight." His words weren't commands. They were oxygen, pushing into the space where machines failed. The monitor flickered, the flat horizon stuttering into a faint rise. then faltering again. Elena pushed harder. Sweat slid down her temples, her arms aching. She wasn't saving a patient now. She was reaching for her brother, for the boy she had abandoned in silence, for the music she had refused to play. Every compression, every shock, every whispered instruction carried the weight of an old regret burning into something fierce and alive. And then a blip, faint, barely perceptible. Another, weak but undeniable. The room held its breath as the line stuttered, staggered, then limped into rhythm, uneven, fragile, but real. Daniel let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh, collapsing onto the chair beside the bed, clutching Emily's hand as if it were the only rope keeping him from falling. His chest heaved with relief, tears streaking down his face. "Thank you," he whispered, though he didn't know if he was speaking to Elena, to Emily, or to something higher he hadn't spoken to in years. Elena staggered back, chest heaving, her gloved hands shaking, not from fear now, but from release. Her eyes blurred with tears she didn't wipe away. She turned just enough so no one could see the depth of what had broken through her, because she knew, in that instant, it wasn't only Emily who had come back. Something inside her had returned, too. The part of her that had hidden behind data and protocol, the part that had sealed itself off to survive. She had fought not just for a child tonight, but for the girl inside her who had once failed a brother. And when the monitor's weak rhythm steadied into something like life, Elena felt her own heart match it, unsteady but alive. For the first time in years, she wasn't just a doctor. She was human again. The waiting room had emptied long ago. The vending machines hummed in the corner, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the faint smell of disinfectant clung to the air like a second skin. Daniel was slumped in one of the rigid chairs, head tilted back, arms crossed loosely over his chest. Exhaustion had finally dragged him under, though even in sleep his body seemed tense, ready to wake at the slightest sound from his daughter's room. His boots were scuffed, his coveralls stained, but to Elena, watching from the doorway, he looked like the most steadfast thing in the hospital. She crossed the room quietly, her steps slow, deliberate, as though she were afraid of breaking the fragile peace. She had spent the last hours in silence, not the kind that calms, but the kind that presses down, filling her with ghosts she could no longer push away. She sat down beside him, her lab coat whispering against the fabric of the chair. For a long moment, she simply watched him breathe, his chest rising and falling, steady in a way her own wasn't. Her voice came out softer than she intended, almost a whisper meant only for herself. "I had a brother." Daniel stirred, his brow furrowing, but he didn't move. Slowly his tired eyes opened, still heavy with exhaustion, and he turned his head to her. He didn't speak, didn't press, just looked at her with the kind of patience that comes from someone who has lived inside grief long enough to recognize it in others. Elena's fingers twisted together in her lap. She hadn't said his name aloud in years. Even now, she couldn't bring herself to. He was 12, leukemia. The words snagged in her throat. She swallowed, forced herself to keep going. "He asked me once, no, more than once, to play for him. Piano. It was his favorite. He said it made him forget the pain for a little while." Her lips trembled, and she pressed them together, her composure threatening to fracture. "I wouldn't do it." I was 16, already so obsessed with being strong, being in control. I thought if I played, it would mean admitting he was dying, and I couldn't. I couldn't watch him die with my music in his ears. She let out a shaky breath, staring at the floor as though the tiles might swallow her whole. So I refused. I stayed silent. And then he was gone. He never got the music he begged for. And I... She broke off, her voice shaking. I built a life on silence after that. Protocols, data, control. If I could measure it, I could survive it. But I couldn't undo that one moment. I let guilt dictate everything I became. Daniel listened without interruption. His eyes stayed on her, calm and steady, no judgment in them, just recognition. She could see in his gaze that he knew what it meant to carry a weight that never lifted, to replay a single moment over and over, wondering how different life might have been if you had just chosen otherwise. Her hands trembled as she finally whispered, "I failed him." For a moment, the only sound was the hum of the machines, the low crackle of lights above. Then Daniel leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his voice low but firm, steady like the roots of an old tree. "You're not failing her." Not anymore. The words cut through her like light in a sealed room, simple, unadorned, but heavy with truth. She hadn't realized how much she needed to hear them, how long she had been waiting for someone, not a colleague, not a superior, not even herself, but someone who understood the rawness of loss, to tell her that failure wasn't the end of the story. Her throat tightened, tears burning at the corners of her eyes. For the first time in years, she let them fall, not in the privacy of her office with whiskey in her mug, but here, in the open beside a man who carried his own grief like a scar he no longer hid. And for the first time since her brother's death, Elena felt absolution, not because she had forgiven herself, but because someone else had looked at her shadow and refused to turn away. Morning crept slowly into the hospital, pale light filtering through blinds that had been shut against the night. The halls smelled of stale coffee and antiseptic, the usual cocktail of survival. But for Daniel the air felt different, thinner, sharper, carrying the weight of another night spent with his heart suspended between prayer and despair. He had dozed in the chair beside Emily's bed, his body bent awkwardly, his hand never letting go of hers. Even in sleep, his grip had remained, as if he feared that loosening it would mean losing her. A faint rustle stirred him awake. At first he thought it was the nurse adjusting the IV or the shuffle of feet in the corridor, but then he felt a shift in her fingers. His eyes flew open. Emily's lashes trembled against her pale cheeks, fluttering as though they were learning to move again. Daniel leaned forward, breath caught in his throat. Slowly, painfully, her eyelids lifted, revealing eyes clouded with exhaustion, but unmistakably alive. "Emily," he breathed, his voice breaking on her name. Her lips parted, dry and cracked, but sound slipped out anyway, barely audible, fragile as the first note of a song. "Daddy." The world broke open inside him. Daniel pressed her small hand to his face, clutching it against the stubble of his cheek, his tears spilling hot and relentless. His body shook with sobs he didn't bother to hide. He kissed her knuckles, her palm, every inch of skin he could reach, whispering, "I'm here, baby girl. I'm here." Elena stood at the foot of the bed, silent witness to the scene. She had walked in minutes earlier to check the charts, prepared for another morning of bracing herself against disappointment, ready to deliver clinical updates in her detached voice. But now she couldn't move. She turned her head away, pressing a hand discreetly to her cheek. But it was useless. Tears slid down regardless, streaking her face, betraying the composure she had worked so hard to maintain. She had told herself for years that hope was dangerous, cruel even, that it built scaffolds too fragile to bear the weight of reality. Yet here it was, defying her, blooming in front of her eyes, in the shape of a child whispering a single word. Emily's eyes closed again, heavy with exhaustion, but her chest rose and fell with steadier rhythm than the night before. The monitors no longer screamed, they hummed. The battle was not over. Elena knew the chart was still filled with numbers that spoke of danger, of setbacks yet to come. But survival wasn't only measured in statistics. Sometimes it was measured in one word, spoken weakly, but spoken at all. Daniel wiped his face with the back of his sleeve, still holding her hand as though it were tethering him to life itself. He leaned close, whispering promises he couldn't stop himself from making. "We'll get through this, Em. You're strong, stronger than me, stronger than the world. You just keep fighting, and I'll never let go." His voice cracked, but the conviction in it was unshakable. Elena stepped back quietly, giving them space, though she couldn't tear her eyes away completely. She thought of her brother, of the silence she had given him instead of music, and for the first time in years, the memory didn't crush her with guilt. Watching Daniel, she realized love didn't erase failure, but it could build something stronger in its place. She had failed once. She didn't want to fail again. Emily had survived the night. That sentence alone carried more weight than any chart or prognosis. It wasn't the end of the battle, but it was proof that hope could take root even in the most sterile of rooms, even against the odds. Elena exhaled slowly, letting herself believe, just for a moment, that maybe hope wasn't cruelty after all. Maybe it was the only medicine stronger than fear. The door to Elena's office slammed open so hard the glass rattled in its frame. Dr. Carmichael stormed in, his face red with fury, the expensive fabric of his suit pulling tight across his shoulders as though even the threads knew to brace for impact. Papers on Elena's desk fluttered in the gust of his entrance, her pen rolling onto the floor. She had been reviewing Emily's latest vitals, letting herself exhale in the rare quiet of the morning, but now the air was thick with accusation. "You've compromised this hospital," Carmichael barked, his voice carrying the force of a gavel. "You've let sentiment dictate treatment. You've risked our reputation, our funding, our credibility. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Elena didn't flinch. She closed the folder on her desk with calm deliberation, rising to her feet with a steadiness that surprised even herself. She had been here before, cornered, accused, forced to defend choices, but something was different this time. Her hands didn't shake. Her voice didn't waver. "No," she said, meeting his eyes with a clarity that cut through his rage. "I haven't compromised medicine. I've reclaimed it." His brow furrowed, confusion slipping briefly into his anger. She continued, her tone firm but quiet, the kind of voice that carried, not because it shouted, but because it refused to be silenced. "For years, you've preached control, detachment, numbers. You've turned medicine into an equation. But children are not equations. Families are not charts. I didn't let emotion rule science. I let humanity rule medicine." Her words hung in the air like a bell's echo. Carmichael's lips curled, not into a smile, but into something sharper. He leaned forward, slamming his hand against the desk. "You think that will stand up when the lawsuits arrive?" When the headlines read, "Doctor endangers child to appease janitor," "You've doomed yourself, Elena. You've doomed this hospital, and I will not let your reckless indulgence tarnish everything we've built." Her pulse quickened, but she stood her ground. For years, fear of disgrace had been the invisible hand guiding her every step, keeping her rigidly aligned with the rules. But now she felt something different rising in her chest, something that burned hotter than fear. Resolve. The office door creaked again, but this time it wasn't fury that entered. It was quiet defiance. Daniel stepped inside, his coveralls still smudged, his face weary but his eyes alight with the same fire that had carried him through every night at Emily's bedside. He didn't hesitate. He walked forward until he stood shoulder to shoulder with Elena. "If caring is a crime," Daniel said, his voice low but unyielding, "then charge us both." The room stilled. Carmichael's mouth opened, ready to lash out again, but the words caught. The weight of Daniel's presence, his simplicity, his refusal to be cowed, it cut through the pomp of Carmichael's threats. Daniel had nothing to lose but everything that mattered, and somehow that gave him more power than all of Carmichael's titles combined. Elena turned her head just enough to look at Daniel. For the first time in weeks, she felt something loosen inside her chest. Not relief, not victory, but freedom. A smile tugged at her lips, not the polished mask she wore for colleagues, not the forced composure she presented to grieving families, but a real smile, born of choice. She had chosen her side, not the board's, not Carmichael's, not the sterile safety of protocols that built walls between her and the people she swore to heal. She had chosen to stand with a father who loved his daughter beyond reason, who had reminded her what medicine was supposed to be, about all along. Carmichael sneered, muttered something about consequences, and stormed out as abruptly as he had entered. The door slammed again, but this time the sound didn't rattle her. It steadied her. Elena exhaled, her shoulders easing as she glanced once more at Daniel. "Thank you," she whispered. He shook his head. "No, thank you," for finally seeing what she needed. And for the first time in years, Elena didn't feel bound by fear of disgrace. She felt free. Weeks later, the ICU doors opened not to alarms, but to quiet celebration. Daniel's hands gripped the wheelchair handles tighter than necessary, as though even this short trip might test the fragile miracle of his daughter's survival. Emily sat bundled in blankets, her small frame thinner than it had been before, but her eyes carried a brightness that hadn't been there in weeks. She leaned her head back, letting the sun pour through the tall windows at the end of the corridor, her lips curving into the faintest smile. The recovery room had been prepared in a way Daniel hadn't expected. No sterile white walls, no blinding lights. This room was gentler, touched with warmth. Sunlight streamed through half-open blinds, painting stripes across the floor. On the table near the window sat something that made him pause. A keyboard, old and slightly dusty, its plastic edges yellowed by time. He looked to Elena, who stood just inside the doorway, her hands clasped together as though she wasn't sure if she had the right to step further in. "It's mine," she admitted, her voice low, almost embarrassed. "From storage. I thought maybe—" Her words trailed off, as though the weight of offering anything beyond medicine was still too new for her. Daniel wheeled Emily closer. The little girl's eyes landed on the keyboard, and her fingers twitched above the blanket. Elena swallowed hard, then crossed the room. She sat on the bench, her back straight, but her hands uncertain as they hovered over the keys. For a moment she didn't move, frozen between memory and fear. Then she pressed one note. The sound was sharp, lonely, but it filled the room all the same. Another note followed, then another, halting, uneven, like a bird testing wings long unused. A lullaby began to take shape, familiar and tender. Her brother's favorite, the one she hadn't played all those years ago. It cracked in places, her fingers stumbling where memory failed, but she pressed on. Each note loosened something inside her, breaking through walls she had spent a lifetime building. Daniel reached for his guitar. It had been leaning against the corner of the room, brought in at the nurse's quiet suggestion. His fingers found the strings with a hesitance that matched Elena's, the sound rusty at first, but true. He began to strum, the chords weaving under her melody, catching her stumbles, lifting the song. The two sounds joined, fragile, imperfect, yet together they created something neither could have made alone. Emily's eyes fluttered closed, her lips parting in the smallest sigh. The tension in her little body eased as she sank into the sound surrounding her. Her smile widened, soft and real, and her hand reached blindly across the blanket until Daniel took it in his. He pressed her fingers to his cheek, still strumming, his tears falling freely now, but not the tears of despair. They were lighter, born of something he hadn't dared to feel in so long. Relief. Elena glanced up once, her eyes meeting his. For the first time, there was no wall between them, no titles, no uniforms, just two people carrying the same grief, now offering the same healing. She pressed harder into the keys, letting the lullaby find its steady rhythm. Daniel matched her, his guitar strong and sure now, his voice humming along softly. For that moment grief had no power in the room. The past did not accuse, the future did not threaten. It was only the present, the sunlight, the music, the fragile miracle of a girl safe between them. The notes filled every corner, wrapping around the machines, softening the sterility of the hospital walls, replacing it with something alive. Emily's breathing slowed, her chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. The lullaby wove itself into her dreams, and her small hand relaxed completely in her father's. Daniel's strumming slowed, Elena's fingers lingered on the final chord, and then silence returned, not empty this time, but full. Daniel looked at his daughter, then at Elena, and whispered, "She's safe." Elena nodded, her own chest rising with a deep breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. For the first time in years, the music had returned, and with it, the sense that maybe healing wasn't just found in medicine. Maybe it was also found in love, and in the courage to play again. The hospital was quieter than usual that evening. The rush of morning rounds had faded, and the echo of footsteps in the corridor felt softer, less urgent. Daniel sat near the window in the recovery room, his guitar resting on his lap. Emily was dozing nearby, her coloring pages scattered across the blanket, crayons rolling lazily to the floor as sleep tugged her into safety. He strummed absent-mindedly, not a song exactly, more a string of notes meant to keep the silence from swallowing him whole. The door creaked open, and Elena stepped in. She wasn't in her lab coat this time, just a sweater and slacks, her hair falling loosely over her shoulders. Without the uniform, she looked less like the doctor he had first known and more like a woman still figuring out who she wanted to be. Daniel stopped playing and glanced at her, cautious. For days now they had circled each other with a kind of fragile respect, both grateful, both wary of what came next. "I want to talk to you," Elena said, moving closer, her voice quieter than usual. There was no authority in it, no command, only intention. She sat on the edge of the chair opposite him, folding her hands in her lap as though bracing herself. "I want to open a program." Daniel raised an eyebrow, unsure where she was going. "A program?" "Music for recovery," she explained. Her eyes flicked to the guitar in his hands, then to the keyboard in the corner, still faintly dusty but alive again after all these years. "A room where children can heal beyond medicine, where sound and love matter as much as charts and monitors." She paused, then added, "And I want you to help lead it." For a moment Daniel just stared at her. The words felt too big, too unreal. His laugh slipped out, soft but edged with disbelief. "You're asking a janitor to run a program?" Elena shook her head firmly. "No, I'm asking a father who taught me how to listen. A man who reminded me that healing isn't just about bodies, it's about souls." Her eyes held his steadily, without pity, without doubt. Daniel's throat tightened, his fingers gripping the neck of the guitar until his knuckles whitened. He looked down at his hands, rough and worn, hands that had scrubbed floors and emptied bins for years, hands that had once carried music but had since carried only survival. Could these same hands build something bigger than himself? Something lasting? He swallowed hard. "I don't have degrees," he said slowly. "I don't have letters after my name. I don't know if I'd even know where to start." "You started already," Elena replied, "the night you played for her. The night you reminded me that silence isn't always absence. It's waiting for someone brave enough to fill it. You've been teaching without knowing it, leading without asking for it." She leaned closer, her voice softening. "You gave me back something I thought I lost forever. And if you can do that for me, imagine what you could do for the children here." Daniel's chest ached in a way that wasn't pain, but release. For years, his life had been reduced to survival, paychecks, meals, the constant calculation of how to make too little stretch far enough. A future had felt like a luxury he didn't deserve to imagine, yet here it was, laid before him, in the form of a woman who believed he was more than his coveralls, more than the mop he pushed. He looked at Emily, her small hand curled loosely around a crayon even in sleep, her chest rising steady, her lips parted in peace. She had fought for her life, and somehow, in fighting for her, he had stumbled into a truth he never expected. Maybe it wasn't too late to fight for his own. His voice trembled when he finally spoke. "You really think I could do this?" Elena's answer was immediate. "I don't just think it. I know it." Daniel exhaled, a long, long breath that carried years of grief and doubt with it. For the first time in as long as he could remember, he saw a future beyond survival. not just for Emily, not just for himself, but for every child who might one day walk into that room, fragile but ready to hear that they mattered. And for the first time, he believed he could be the one to tell them. The garden had once been a graveyard for weeds and broken benches, a forgotten patch of land tucked behind the hospital where concrete had nearly swallowed the earth whole. But now, months later, it had been reborn. Rows of wildflowers swayed in the breeze. Vines climbed trellises painted by volunteers, and a small fountain bubbled at the center, its sound a soft counterpoint to the laughter of children. The air smelled of soil and lavender, not antiseptic, and the hospital windows reflected light instead of grief. Emily ran barefoot along the worn stone path, her laughter ringing out so freely it startled Daniel every time he heard it. For so long he had lived in fear of silence, of monitors flatlining, of a breath that never returned. To hear her laugh now, unrestricted, alive, was a sound he never dared to believe he'd get back. She carried a handful of dandelions clutched tight in her fist, her hair wild in the late summer wind, her cheeks flushed with the kind of color that belonged to the healthy. Daniel sat on a bench beneath an old oak tree, his guitar balanced against his knee. His fingers plucked strings that were no longer stiff with rust, but humming with life. Children gathered around him, some patients, some siblings, some simply curious. They leaned in as though drawn by a flame, their faces lit by a mixture of wonder and relief. His voice carried low and warm, wrapping around the garden like a shield against the world outside the walls. He sang not as a performer, but as a father who had learned that music could mend things medicine could not. Elena stood a little distance away, her arms folded loosely, though not in defense this time. The weight she had once carried, protocols, guilt, the memory of a brother she couldn't save, felt lighter now, as if every note Daniel strummed released another tether. She watched Emily dart past a row of marigolds, laughing so hard she stumbled, and something inside her softened further. For years she had been afraid to step into moments like this, afraid they might break. But watching now, she realized some moments weren't meant to be controlled. They were meant to be lived. Daniel's eyes lifted, finding Elena across the garden. His song faded into chords, then into silence. He lowered the guitar, his voice carrying only for her. "You saved her," he whispered, the words more gratitude than statement, spoken like a secret. Elena shook her head gently, her eyes never leaving Emily. "We saved each other." The words hung between them, true and undeniable. Daniel looked down at his guitar, the very same instrument he had once shoved into a closet, too painful to touch. Now it was the heartbeat of the garden, the reason children gathered, the reason hope had found soil again. He realized then that the garden wasn't just for Emily. It was for him, for Elena, for anyone who had ever believed silence meant the end. The sun dipped lower, setting the flowers ablaze in gold. The children clapped, begging for another song, and Daniel obliged, strumming again as their voices joined in with his. Elena moved closer, her hand brushing the rough wood of the bench beside him. She didn't sit at first, only watched the way his fingers moved, sure and steady, as though they had never been broken by grief. Then she lowered herself beside him, close enough that the sound of his guitar seemed to vibrate through her own chest. Emily skipped over, dropping her dandelions in Elena's lap, and for a moment Elena simply held them, surprised by how something so fragile could feel like treasure. She looked at Daniel, then at Emily, and thought of her brother, not with guilt, but with peace. Maybe this was what he had wanted for her all along, to live, to love, to find music again. The garden glowed as the sun sank, golden light, spilling across stone paths and painted benches. In its soil grew more than flowers. It held the roots of second chances, wild and free, untamed by rules or fear. And in that space where laughter rang louder than memory, Daniel, Elena, and Emily found their second life. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share where you're reading from in the comments below. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because more stories of hope, healing, and second chances are on the way, and you won't want to miss them.